Okay, well, I guess this is going to be my first video of addressing the highly accomplished accreditation and the 37 standard descriptors. I'm just going to run through this video to see whether or not I can just simply talk through all the things that I need to explain. I've got a lot to say and just trying to articulate it into some information. All right, so here we go. The first thing I need to show you is I want to show you this, which is my way in which I present sometimes information to my students regarding their journey of the HSC. And we talk a lot about, yes, it's important to gain the knowledge, but also how do we interpret and how do we use that knowledge. Initially, when I first started out teaching, I was, for example, apprehensive about being a HSC marker. The rumours that you hear about being a HSC marker is that you always get in trouble, or you get kicked off, or you make lots of mistakes, and a child's future is in the balance. And once I became a HSC marker, it became very clear that the amount of professional development that you have is huge, and the knowledge that you gain to pass on to students, you end up seeing an improvement in your results. Not that we're so much results driven, because we're really after the holistic approach to learning, or the holistic approach to a child's development. But one of the aspects of gaining the holistic approach is that we can support them to gain a better understanding of improving their results in the HSC. So one of the things that I like to do after I've gone through the process of doing HSC marking, of course I have my HSC exam papers on speed dial. I can call them up, and in fact what I really do like to do is call up HSC papers and explain to students the process of where I marked an exam. For example, just recently I was teaching a concept, and I explained to the students that I actually marked this section of my HSC paper in 2021, and I showed them how to approach each of the question based on a marker's perspective, and that sort of reassured them that what they were doing and what they were learning along the way was beneficial for them. Now, the other thing that I like to do is, of course, we all have at my school access to Schools Online, and it's important that as a teacher I use this data to further improve my own teaching. So one area that I like to look at in detail is I like to look at my RAP analysis of my exam, and I go through every question one at a time. So I'll just demonstrate that, where I go to the IPT, and I can look at the overall achievement of my students in my class. I only had 4, and when I look at this one, for example, this part in particular makes me very happy, because we don't do this section. So this is an elective part of it, and we don't do this section. And during the trial, one of my students actually did one of these sections and performed very poorly. Of course, I had to mark it, and then we're fortunate for us, after the trial, we were able to talk about examination technique, what not to do, and what we make sure we do. And one of the things in particular was make sure that you answer the questions that we have studied in the elective section of the paper. The other thing I like to do, of course, is to look at the comparative of each of the questions. So I can see, as I'm all about continual improvement, as we should be as teachers. I'm looking at these charts in detail. So what I tend to do is I'll look at a particular question. For example, this is question 1, which is multiple choice. And of course, one of my students got this wrong. And then I can go back and I can actually look at the paper and I can actually see the question in particular, what was the question and why a student would actually answer it incorrectly. So you can see here that, 3 out of 4 got the answer correct, but 1 got it wrong. I can't go back and change things. I can't go back to the student and say, you got this wrong. But I can say, I can take the question out and show my future students who are doing the HSC and talk about why a student would give this as an answer and break it down like that. And as I mentioned before, of course, I can look at these questions, in particular, the ones that I actually did, and talk about this one. This, in particular, last year was quite a difficult series of questions. And when I marked this, I marked about 400 responses to these questions, and I know a lot about how to approach these questions correctly. For example, this one here was a 6-mark question, which is one of the highest that we get in IPT, and the students found it very, very difficult. Across the state, they found it very difficult to gain the 6 marks out of 6. Now, if I look at my analysis of that question in my course, you can see that we are, half the class got full marks, half the class didn't get full marks. So my immediate reaction to this is I need to ensure that my students are up here rather than down here and work on the reasons why. So we need to look at the question in particular, which is this one here, and explain to the students in the future how to maximise their marks in this question. So I'm constantly doing that. I'm constantly looking at these results, analysing these results, and going through them. And the one that I talked about just before, question 27D, here is my results for that. Doesn't show you which student, whose student, or what student, but we should be, if I'm focusing on that, we should be getting here. And so I take that, not so much as personally, but I take it as feedback so that I can get these marks and take them up into this next level here. And that's very important for me. And one of the ways that I have done that from here is to look at our HSC key terms and our HSC verbs that are addressed in each of the questions. So I have done this in several ways. One of the ways that I've done it is on my YouTube channel. I have a YouTube channel here, and I have this video here which talks about, for example, if we go back a little bit, I'm not going to play it, but if we go back, I talk about showing the students this, where there's a HSC Opt question, which is this one, and I break it down into this is the verb or the key term. It's got an S on the end of benefits, so that means it is the plural, and it says for this system, so this is the context. We haven't talked about the background. And the other thing that's really important is I break down the marking guide for the students. A lot of the time, the mark guide is not broken down well enough, and if I call up, for example, the 2022 HSC mark guide for that particular question, which my students struggled with, there is a response there, there's an answer there. I don't like to use that as a guide for my marking, and my best practice is that I like to use this mark guide as my best practice for my marking and my feedback for my students. So what I do is I run through this little video which talks about the different ways in which you need to address a question, and then I've used the alarm colours. Now in my school we use these colours as the alarm focus for English writing and our literacy, and we also I've colour coded these based on those alarms. So this up here is actually posters displayed in our English rooms, and then the students come to my class and they see the same colours, and so they can recognise what these colours are. And each one of these is a poster up in my room, and there's information along that. Not only is it a poster in my room, but my students also have access to them. So you can see that here is the HSC key verbs. There's 44 of them, and my students are allowed to they access these, and they are allowed to use them. And what I have done is I've based every question on something to do with a light, so something that they can relate to. So each one of these has a question around a light. So illustrate the sun showing its layers, because that's a question on illustrate, or we have something simple like define or formal definitions, define the term light. So we just go, here is the model or the answer of that. So that's taken from the HSC NESA key verbs, and I've put them all together, all 44 of those, with increasing difficulty, and placed them up on my classroom walls, and also I've provided them on the OneNote for the students. Then what happens is, in order for me to provide them with questions, I actually provide them with learning tasks where they are to do those verbs. So this one here is compare and contrast each method. So I've said this is worth 5 marks, and here is your breakdown of your marks, just so that they get that opportunity to practice the ability to create responses that do what the marking criteria asks them to do. So instead of them having a visual of a sample answer like we see in the marking guide, here's a sample answer, what they now see is one of these, and so what they can do is visualize, okay, so it's worth 5 or 6 marks. What does it look like for me to acquire those 6 marks by addressing the verb and answering the question as well? So did they address the verb? Did they use the context? And did they address the plural? I've also found that in talking to my students after they've sat HSC style questions, that they, when they're sitting there, they use it as a checklist. They use this component here, this one here, as a checklist. Did I describe? Did I follow the verb? Did I ensure that if it was plural, that I addressed more than one in my response? And did I address the context of the system, for example, and check it off? And if they know that they have described something, so they've gone back and they have looked at the key verb of describe, which is down here, have I done what it says? Provide characteristics and features of what it's looking for. So this one here says describe sunlight, for example, and here's the characteristics and features of sunlight. And I found that students have provided me with feedback where they have said, I ensured that when I was doing this, that I did these 3 things to ensure that I maximised my mark. Now, that doesn't mean that their marking is going to be, top marks all the time, but they've got a leg up if they are doing that as well in the technique. So I always say to my students, even if you don't know the answer, if you're not sure about the answer, make sure you put something down, because for 1 mark, they get an identifier. So we learn these verbs, and we learn all the verbs so that we know potentially what our mark could possibly be, but most of the time we're trying to maximise our mark by addressing the verb that it does ask for. So that's the analysis of that work and the analysis of that HSC for the benefit of our students, to ensure that what they're doing is they are answering these questions properly, and that's stemmed from my professional development in HSC marking and my research and my understanding of what is required.